The $1 trillion is the headline figure,
Right.
but looking inside it is so important. I try to remain optimistic, but I try to be realistic. And we don't have to agree on everything at COP29. Having a shared understanding of the importance. So if we're to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to invest in all those things.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainability Karma. I'm your host, Rajiv Tikoo. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Professor Nicholas Stern. He wears many hats, and one of them is that of the most famous climate economist in the world. Welcome, Professor Nicholas Stern, to this episode of Sustainability Karma.
Good to be with you, Rajiv. Thank you for inviting me.
What is the expected outcome at COP29 according to you?
COP29 is likely to be focused on finance. The ability to reduce carbon emissions and the ability to adapt to climate change depend on investment. You have to invest in the new clean technologies. You have to invest to make your infrastructure more resilient. You have to invest in your natural capital, your forests and your land and your water and so on. So to be sustainable, both in the sense of cutting emissions and being resilient and looking after your natural capital, you must invest. And invest means that you have to come up with the finance for the investment. Now, most investment in most countries around the world is financed at home. But some poorer countries will need some support on that finance from outside. Actually, many poorer countries will need some support for that finance from outside. So the big issue for this COP in COP29 in Baku is first to understand the investment, but particularly to focus on the finance for that investment.
How realistic is it to expect agreement on raising $1 trillion per year for the climate fund?
Now, $1 trillion is a number that comes actually from some work I've been doing with Amar, Bhattacharya and with Vera, Songwe for the presidencies of the COPs. Last year, the presidency was United Arab Emirates. This year, the presidency is with Azerbaijan, and for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So they asked us to do some work on the magnitudes of the investments and particularly the magnitudes of the finance. And we argued that by 2030, the external flows in finance that would be necessary from emerging market and developing economies outside China, China doesn't need the external finance. So for those economies, the poorer countries of the world, we argued that the investments were of a size that would need around $1 trillion from outside for them to be fully financed, bearing in mind that a lot of finance would come from inside. So those numbers came from our work. Now, that $1 trillion is not just one great big fund. This is per year. We give the figure for 2030, but of course, these flows will have to happen every year because the investments will have to happen every year. So those flows would be for the energy transition. That means building new generating capacity, which is clean, solar and wind and hydro and so on, and the grids that will facilitate that. They'll also, that will in large measure, not all, that in large measure would be private sector flows. There'll be other flows, for example, building metros, how we build our cities. A lot of that would have to be public investment. There'll be other flows which will be around investing in places and people where the fossil fuel extraction has been disrupted. The world cannot go on burning coal, and it will have to reduce that, and that will mean shutting coal mines. Well, that means there's a social responsibility to invest in those places and in those people. So I'm giving these examples to emphasize that this $1 trillion of flow is not some pot or some fund. It's different kinds of flows. There'll be private sector flows. There'll be development banking flows, World Bank, Asia Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure, investment bank, there'll be these kinds of flows from multilateral development banks. And there will have to be flows from overseas development aid, from voluntary carbon markets. There's a technical thing at the IMF called special drawing rights. There are going to have to be some flows which are flows which don't involve any debt service, which are more or less like grants, because some parts of the investment around adaptation, around natural capital, will not be very easy to get private finance for, or not very easy to pay interest rates, to pay interest on, even though they're very important and valuable activities that are being financed. So that $1 trillion of flows into emerging markets and developing economies outside China is a very important figure. And I hope that figure is recognized and it should be recognized increasingly, I think it is, at COP29. But it is made up of different things. And how it's made up is very important. Private sector, multilateral development banks, these very low-cost concessional flows. And in that last category, possibly new forms of international taxation, for example, on shipping or airlines, which are not subject to carbon taxes or carbon prices now. So the $1 trillion is the headline figure, right, but looking inside it is so important.
How optimistic are you, given our previous experience with climate funding and also the experience of recent biodiversity COP16?
There, I try to remain optimistic, but I try to be realistic also. I think a key step forward is the big expansion in the multilateral development bank lending to the poorer countries of the world, because that lending is low cost lending. It's not free, but it's low cost, much lower cost than countries would have to pay if they borrowed on world markets. And those development banks can take a long-term view. They don't have to look for money back in just 4 or 5 years, as often private sector flows do. Also, private sector worries about risk. They have to. They're investing their own money, or they're investing money on behalf of other people. They have to worry about risk. And the multilateral development banks can share risk, and they can take that long-term view. So to get those private sector flows up and running, and that means a big expansion, the multilateral development banks are going to have to play a very important role. So I hope that that recognition, we've argued that that should be a tripling from the flows from the multilateral development banks. We hope that that will be a centerpiece, at least of the understanding. And we don't have to agree on everything at COP29, but having a shared understanding of the trillion, having a shared understanding of the importance of the multilateral development bank scale up, and that they work much better with the private sector. Those two things, I think, as understandings will be very valuable. And then one can go on to COP30 in Brazil, which is next year, and perhaps nail down some of the details of that understanding. But being clear about the magnitude and being clear that it's made up of different things, it's not just one single pot, being clear about the importance of the expansion of the multilateral development banks, that would be a valuable outcome, even if all the details are not nailed down.
What would be the other key related issues under discussion, according to you?
The next year is the schedule for what's called nationally determined contributions. Now, it's not a very elegant set of words, but the idea is that, and this comes from Paris, COP, the big COP in Paris, where the temperature target of well below 2 degrees and best efforts on 1.5 degrees as temperature increases, maximum temperature increases. That was agreed in Paris in COP21 in 2015. And that set schedules. It set schedules for agreeing on finance. It set schedules for agreeing on targets for the reduction in emissions in countries. So it's called nationally determined contributions. And for example, India has declared that it will be aiming for net zero by 2070. And of course, there's a path to that. China has declared for net zero by 2060, and there's a path for that. China has declared for maximum emissions by 2030 or before. So that each country comes forward with a description of its path, and that's called nationally determined contributions. Now, that's a good way forward because it means each country works it out for itself, which is as it should be. The problem is that if you look at all the ambitions through those NDCs, that it actually adds up to emissions which are far too many for the declared target of well below 2 degrees. And that declared target is wise because to go above 2 degrees is extremely dangerous. Indeed, to go above 1.5 is very dangerous also. The world now is around 1.2 or 1.3 degrees centigrade higher than the benchmark, which is the the second half of the 19th century. And we're seeing everywhere the immense dangers, even at 1.2, 1.3. And we're likely heading above 1.5. We'll have to try to pull back from that if we do. So those were the targets set in Paris. They were set wisely because of the dangers of exceeding them. The NDCs were the way in which each country says what it plans to do. And next year is the target date for the next round of nationally determined contributions. So those discussions as to what level of ambition there's likely to be on the nationally determined contributions are very important, because ultimately it's those that determine whether or not we'll be able to keep climate change to a manageable degree. And we're already seeing the terrible consequences even of where we are now, and it's going to get worse. So accelerating that action is very important, and I hope that the discussions in COP29 are realistic around what we have to do.
Quite a few heads of state and heads of banks have opted to be out of the COP29. What could be the reason, and how would it impact the decisions there?
Well, obviously it's better if the presidents are there and the prime ministers are there. But some of them may be waiting and seeing, because probably the COP30 in Brazil will be a bigger COP. Now, this COP29 is significant. We've talked about the finance side, we've talked about the nationally determined contributions, but I suspect that COP30 will be the bigger COP, and maybe some of them are saving themselves for that. But I do hope that increasingly those leaders will recognize that this is not simply a matter of cutting things. It's actually a very different form of growth, and a much more attractive form of growth than the dirty, destructive models of the past. And I've been coming to India for 50 years now. I first came in 1974, and I've been coming once or twice a year since then. And I've lived in India for extended periods. It gives me great joy, I have to say, to come to India. But we all know, for example, that breathing in Delhi is a problem. I mean, the air is very polluted. It stunts the progress of children. It brings on cancer and heart disease and so on. The models we followed in the past, we know, are dirty and destructive. So this new way of doing things, with the clean electricity and with electric vehicles and so on, and with much more public transport, this clean way of doing things is just much better. It's more efficient. The clean is cheaper than the dirty across many of our, not all, but many of our activities. And so I hope that increasingly people will see, and I think they are seeing, that this is much more than simply reducing emissions. It's actually much more positively finding an attractive way, a much better way of doing things. And I think India's leadership last year, 2023, of the G20, India put this sustainable resilience and inclusive development right at the top of the list. So I think India's leadership last year was excellent in the G20, and I had the privilege of being quite close to some parts of that. India's leadership in setting out the agenda for the reform of the multilateral development banks through the group, the high-level expert group, chaired by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers, that produced a very good report on the expansion of the MDBs, commissioned by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. So India last year showed that it understood, and more than that, it was leading on this new approach to development. And I hope that this perspective comes through strongly in COP29 and even more strongly in COP30. And I think India can play a leading role in saying, look, there's just a much better way of doing things. It's in our hands, but we have to invest to make it happen.
Coming to the larger issue of sustainable development goals, progress has been lagging with only 16% of the targets on track. What could be done to accelerate that progress at this stage?
Investment in climate action, investment in cleaner electricity, investment in cleaner transport, expanding the electricity supply, making our homes and our roads and our bridges and our dams and so on, our water supply, much more resilient. All this is about development. The climate action is just a part of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's not something separate or something different. It's absolutely core to the Sustainable Development Goals. So when we're talking about climate action, when we're talking about the COPs and so on, we are talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. All our action should be sustainable. Investment in health and education, in particular, is a big part. It's a big part of sustainability. That's a story which we have to be very clear about. It's not some diversion. We need our clean infrastructure. We need our forests. We need to restore our degraded land, and we need the health and education along with it. So we should see these as all parts of development. And I like to talk about 4 forms of capital. There's the physical capital, which is our infrastructure, our homes, our roads and so on. And then there's our human capital, which is our health and our education. And then there's our natural capital, all our biodiversity and our forests and the restoring of degraded land, managing our oceans and our rivers and so on. That natural capital is a huge part of what we have to look after and invest in, and indeed of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we have our social capital, which is how we work together as communities, how we build our institutions, our norms of behavior and so on, how we act to support each other. That's social capital, and that can be eroded and it can be built. So if we're to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to invest in all those things. And of particular importance, though, in that context, I would make the climate action, because on this, there's a deadline. The later we leave it, the more damaging it becomes. And it is through our natural capital and our biodiversity. It is through our different forms of energy, all about development. But in this case, there's time pressure. Delay is dangerous.
You have been coming to India for long, working here. What are your observations on India's development in the last few years or over the decades?
Well, my perspective is 50 years. And in the 50 years that I've been coming to India and twice lived for long periods in India, the change has been quite remarkable. I mean, the one village where I've been working through that time, it's a small village in Moradabad district of UP. It's a poor village in a poor state. Even there, the change has been really very striking, even though it's still a very poor place. We've seen, for example, electricity come to the village. We've seen actually a tarmac road come to the village. We've seen strong investment by the people of Palanpur in their own agriculture. And when we first went there were just Persian wheels and one or two pumping sets. Now, of course, the irrigation is much more sophisticated. There were no tractors, and there are tractors there now. I mean, there are motorbikes where, only a few people simply had bicycles. The girls are all going to school now, where when we first went there, actually rather few went to school. There are many more jobs in the local towns in Chandosi and Moradabad and so on. Very few, when we were there for the first time, I think nobody had been to Delhi, even though it's only 100 and something miles from Delhi. So that's a village transformed. And that is a place where probably the progress hasn't been quite as fast as India, as in India as a whole. But now you see India leading the world in, for example, in its digitization. Aadhaar is an extraordinary achievement. It enables so much in better administration. India's AI and IT companies are world leading. India showed itself during the pandemic. Well, we knew the capacity was there, but India showed itself a leading player in medicine, and particularly in medicines by biochemicals. So India really has established itself on the world stage. It's the fastest growing big economy in the world, and that statement, I think, will be true over the next couple of decades. So the transformation over those 50 years has really been remarkable. The downside has been the damage to India's own environment, to the air quality of its cities. So I do think that the top of the list for India in the coming decade is not only to keep investment in people, in their health and education, to keep investment in clean infrastructure and so on moving, but also to take good care of its biodiversity and its natural environment, because the worse that gets, the more difficult it is to continue development. And the economy is a subsidiary of the environment in which it's situated. And that part of the story in India, I worry. And the North Indian monsoon could just be turned upside down. The Himalayas are, in a sense, an important sense, the third pole in the world, and actually arguably the most important one. And if the snows and the ice melt there, the implications, not just for India, but for all the countries that depend on the water of the Himalayas, will be enormous. So I do think that with all that material success, with all the success on life expectancy and education, which India has shown, that story of its climate and its biodiversity, the air that people breathe, is a real problem. It's recognized, but I hope that will be center to India's development strategies in the future.
Stern, it has been wonderful talking to you in a wide range of subjects and issues, particularly about deconstructing the finance issue. So thanks a lot for sparing your time.
It's a pleasure, Rajiv.
We hope you like this program. We look forward to your feedback on our WhatsApp number 9818120554. For participation in this program, write to us at sustainability.karma@gmail.com. Looking forward to meet you again. Till then, goodbye from all of us. Sustainability Karma, a podcast series on sustainable development, sustainability and ESG.